Father Kennedy doesn't make many mistakes, but he said, I have 45 minutes. Well, I've been out of circulation for a long time. That's just the beginning. He invited me to be here tonight because of the history I carry inside of myself of this building and the naming of rooms and the reasoning behind that. Almost 30 years ago, when we first moved into this house we had built for us to be church in, we thought about naming rooms. We didn't want to just do meeting room 1, 2, 3. And yes, we would pick some of the traditional saints and people from the Bible, but we also were aware that there were people, as the St. John's prayer book says every day, blessed among us. People who are not on the official calendar of saints, but you just know by their life and their story they are blessed. So we named the library the Anne Frank Library, the little Jewish girl hiding from the Nazis, writing her thoughts and hopes for the future and her fears and her growing. We named the Dorothy Day Social Space after Dorothy Day, the co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, known for her hospitality, especially for the least of the least. And I got to say, Patrick, you've been such a good example of creating hospitality that's been woven now into the fabric of this community. We named the Dag Hammarskjöld offices. Dag Hammarskjöld, one of the first heads of the UN. In his writings, you find out he's a mystic. The idea that administration can be a holy thing. And then we came to the chapel, and it really wasn't much of a discussion. Thomas Merton had only been dead for some 15 years, but he already had made a mark on so many people's spiritual lives, and it was clear that for decades that would be the thing. Next week's bulletin, Father Murtaugh has a couple of pages on the life and history of Thomas Merton, so you might read that to get a little bit of the flavor of him. I think what strikes us about Thomas Merton is he advocates a spirituality that is not a pious, sweet little get-out-of-the-world hiding place. His spirituality is a very engaging one and a very challenging one, and I'd like to suggest two of the challenges that I hope, as his icon sits in our chapel, will constantly challenge us in our journeys. The first is, he says, every moment and every event of every person's life on earth plants something in their soul, like a seed. And like the seeds that blow with the winds and fall on the ground, not all take root because the ground has to be ready. And he challenges us that solitude is the way we prepare our inner soul for all those graces and all those insights and all those things that God plants in our life hour by hour and day by day. And he acknowledges solitude is not just for the monk. In fact, he says that sometimes it's a danger to the monks because they can think because solitude is built into their lives, they're better than everybody else. He says everybody must have some sort of solitude, even a minute or two here and there, grabbed between all the noise. And that's the challenge. Because the inner journey is more important than the outer journey. So that's challenge number one. Second challenge happened on the corner of 4th and Walnut Street in Louisville, Kentucky, when he had left the monastery for a day for some medical treatment in Louisville. Standing on the corner of 4th and Walnut, he looked around and saw all these people and instantly knew he loved them because they were connected. And so his writings more and more invited us to realize there are no strangers. The great words on the icon are, we are afraid of others because we are afraid of ourselves, and we are afraid of ourselves because we're afraid of God. It's in those relationships to see it's all linked together. And he's very practical in some of it. His words would be very well in our current mode of not being able to talk to each other. He says when you're talking about politics or religion or something that's so complicated and at so many sides, if you can't find something good the other person is saying, you're not listening. Wow. We're connected, but we have to discover those ways in which are connected. So those are the two challenges. A little word or two about icons. Father Kennedy wrote, was it last week in the bulletin, the week before, some great things about icons. The little handout today has some things about icons. In Russia, pilgrims would dress very simply, but they would wear an icon in front. As Father Kennedy said, icons are windows to heaven. So the pilgrim wanted, as they walked around, as people approached them, for them to see at least a glimpse into heaven. Now, the goal was eventually you wouldn't need to wear the icon because you were the icon. You were the window into heaven. And that might sound kind of esoteric and like that's really hard to do and it never happens, but let me tell you two stories of people who have been icons, windows into heaven, living ordinary lives like us. On Memorial Day at the Veterans Memorial over by Purgatory Creek, a man from town, Bob Schiebler, was the main speaker. He was a veteran from Vietnam, and he told the story of when he was going to be shipped out. His dad suggested that he might go and spend a little time with his grandfather. His grandfather was old and didn't know what would happen while he was gone, and he was going off to war. Didn't know what would happen there, so he did. He drove over to Green Bay where his grandfather lived, and they had a good morning and talked over a lot of things, and he was getting ready to leave, and his grandfather got up and with his two bony arms reached out and grabbed Bob by the arm and said, "I have something I want to tell you. If you are ever in charge of prisoners of war, treat them kindly, because God loves them as much as God loves you." That's an icon. That's a window into heaven. And Bob went on to say that he was in some pretty tough areas of fighting in Vietnam. One time a few of their people got lost and radioed back that they had a prisoner, but they didn't know how to get back to camp. It turns out they're about 3 miles away, so Bob and a few others volunteered to go. And they found them, and the prisoner, because they had been walking on a very rocky bed of a dried up creek, and he had no shoes, his feet were all cut up. So how did they get back through enemy territory with this enemy who could shout out any time and endanger their lives? So his first instinct was just to shoot the guy. Practical, neat, they'd all get back safe. And then he remembered his grandfather's icon, his grandfather's window into heaven. And he picked up the prisoner, put him over his shoulder, and carried him 3 miles back to safety. In the first half of the walk, the man cried and sniffled, and then he realized that he was going to be saved, and he started kissing the neck of Bob. And when they got back, the medics took care of the prisoner, and next day, word came down that the prisoner would talk to nobody but Bob. And trying to find some common ground, and then finally Bob said he took out his bayonet and drew a picture of the United States and pointed where he lived and started talking about his family. And then, to the shock of the MPs in the room, he handed the North Vietnamese guy the bayonet. He said you could hear the safeties go off, all the clicks of all the guns in the room. But the man drew a picture of Vietnam and where he came from. He turned out to be a sergeant major, and in the exchange of information, hundreds of lives were saved on both sides because a grandfather was a window into heaven. Second story. Sometimes just living our lives, loving the people we've vowed to love. Jean Vanier, who's a founder of the L'Arche communities, tells of some friends he had that lived in Paris. The man was a very successful businessman, very wealthy, very busy. And then one day he found out that the wife was slipping into Alzheimer's. And the husband had all the resources he needed. He could have put her in the nicest hospital with round-the-day care and everything. And then he remembered his vow to her, in sickness and in health. So he left his business, his busyness, his importance, and spent his days bathing her and clothing her and feeding her and keeping her safe. As he said to John Vernier later, I have become more human in this process. And then he called him one morning and says, she woke up last night. She woke me up last night. And for a moment she had come out of the fog. And she looked at me and says, I know what you are doing for me, and I love you for it. And slipped back into the fog of Alzheimer's. That's an icon. Two old people loving each other as they had promised over many years. I'd like to end by just reading a prayer, and this is another part of Thomas Merton, reminding us that spirituality is not being right on everything, not always doing the right thing, not having all the knowledge, not having things mapped out black and white, not always being right, but having a desire to follow God. My dear God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone.